So in this video, we're going to discuss a situation where you are already done with your machine learning modeling part. You have took a simple data set, for example, Boston housing prediction data set, and you built the machine learning part around it. The model is here obviously serialized as a joblib file, and you already built the glue code around it. And then you also decided you want to expose it. So you wrote the app.py file with the Flask, and you expose the endpoints to basically access and make these predictions. And now the question is, how do you make this even better? How do you make sure that there's a reduced technical debt with your machine learning project and that you can deploy this project successfully on certain cloud platforms? And that's what we are exactly going to discuss shortly in this walkthrough regarding Azure. So what the architecture in our case is going to look like is the following. So we are going to host our code on GitHub, and basically in case of event change, so for example, merging a feature branch to the development branch or a main branch, then we are going to trigger the Azure pipelines that they are going to execute the CI or the CD pipeline and forward that to the Azure App Service. The Azure App Service, you can imagine it as a platform, managed platform as a service solution, where it's basically similar to Amazon Beanstalk, AWS Beanstalk, where you can serve and host your code without much service upkeep. So without much sysops, you can just upload your code, do some minor configuration, and basically have it served from this cloud provider. And in our case, obviously, it's going to be the Azure equivalent. And from this point on, we are taking the Flask machine learning API and consuming the predictions for the task that we wanted to automate. So this is the high-level overview of what we want to achieve, and how we are going to achieve it will be described in detail here in the code and the comments, but I want to fly over through all the stuff and basically explain in more detailed points that I think are more important. As I said, we already find the model here, the exposed endpoints here, and some shell scripts that are going to be needed. To run it locally, what we basically do is activate the environment, install everything that needs to be installed from the requirements, and then run our app.py and basically expose the endpoints. But what we are actually interested in is how do we do the same steps in the Azure pipelines, right? So how do we do that in the Azure equivalent service for implementing the CI/CD pipelines? And for that part, we basically need to log on to the Azure shell. We already have our Azure account, et cetera, and this is going to look like something like this. We need to make sure that the GitHub repo where we host our code has the Azure pipelines enabled. So it's very important to enable this service for the specific repository that we host our code on, and then clone this repository to the Azure Cloud Shell. As I said, details can be found on the individual documentation of these services or the linked clips and or documents in this specific repository that I'm presenting here now. When we are done with that, we just repeat the local steps in the previous explanation, under the explanation under the point number 1, where we have to activate our environment and then do the same old installs and running the app.py and executing the make predictions, which basically just sends some data to this endpoint to return the predictions from. When we are done with that, we have to fire up our app service. Remember, that's the equivalent AWS Beanstalk service on the Azure, where it allows us very easily to host our application and host our code that we want a whole world to access. And after following these steps, we are basically going to have a very simple access point, meaning the HTTPS endpoint, where from this endpoint on, as you see here in the screenshot, we can just access it and send with another /predict. We can send our post requests and get the needed predictions. And this is again here verified and repeated what I just said in a form of shell script and in a form of code. But what is the main gist of this whole conversation is configuring it basically with the Azure DevOps and the Azure DevOps project, where as another service of Azure Suite, we can connect the Azure DevOps project to the Azure Azure shell that we just opened before, and our Azure account where we just created the app service. And there are two possible options here. Here, as you see, there are multiple steps that I described here that you can follow through, where there is a very intuitive UI view of configuring these pipelines and the CI part. And if you follow this through wholly and connect it to basically the previous Azure resource group and the credentials that you configured previously, you can connect it very easily and give permissions to all the pipelines that you need. And what happens is that when you follow again these pipelines steps, after creating pipeline, etc., again, you will read it in detail when you get to the repository. What you will get out of this document, as you are following the very drag and drop clicking procedure on this UI of Azure DevOps, output of that will be the Azure DevOps.yaml file that you can see actually already here. So that's the output file that you are expected to be generated in your project's structure, in your working directory. And there, what you will see is, as you were creating this from the UR standpoint, you will see multiple stages. And these stages are exactly the box that you ticked off or configured to be important as you are executing your CI pipeline. So in our case, we are talking about build job that's basically configured with the virtual virtual machine image, the Python version is specified, etc., But more importantly, the scripts that are to be executed as these pipelines are being forwarded to the Azure. What are the scripts, meaning what are the steps to be performed as the CI pipeline is being executed? And in our particular case, as you can see in the code, very briefly, we see we are activating the environment, we are installing all the necessary requirements, we are basically doing all the linting, the integration tests, formatting the code, etc., making sure that all the individual sub modules of our machine learning solution is working properly and is being tested. And then when we are done with that, the second stage is deploy, where we basically take this artifact and deploy it to the service that's need to be deployed. One final note that's important to be said here is that it's very easier to configure this directly from the UI instead of writing the YAML file and the explicit code that's to be understood underneath the YAML file, because as I said, this will be generated automatically. You don't need to write it or remember the specifics of what's the inputs, what's the display name, etc. This will be generated, as I said, through the UI. And that's basically that. We can then, when we are done with this step, we can verify the continuous delivery pipeline of Azure pipelines by changing something to the app.py, merging this to the main branch. Remember, the whole point is this: when the change event triggers, the Azure pipelines execute the CI, which is then forwarded to the hosted solution, meaning actually the part that executes the predictions, the machine learning predictions, and from there on, we can consume it and we can consume the new changes to our code. But the most importantly, all of the code is being tested and all of the steps that are necessary for the CI/CD pipeline are being executed.